I think in a situation which is as tense as what we are seeing, uh, and given the fact that the Americans, for example, have simply abandoned, not just abandoned, abandoned in a rather bad way, the Ukrainians, it's not important whether what the Americans have done is right or wrong. What is important is what is the messaging which goes out. And the messaging for countries which look to the United States as a net provider of security and stability in their regions, or for that matter globally, are no longer sure about whether they can rely upon the United States. The Chinese, for their part, will also be reading the signals coming out of the United States very, very carefully. And there is this very disturbing talk of the US, the Russians, and the Chinese, in a sense, carving out the world between themselves. This is what is being speculated, that the Russians will now, Europe is going to be left on its own, and they'll have to handle the Russians on their part. The Chinese will be the SHO of the Indo-Pacific.
The Indo-Pacific region is becoming increasingly crucial for several strategic, economic, and geopolitical reasons. To discuss what's next for this region, Sushant Sareen, a strategic affairs expert, is joining me from New Delhi. Mr. Sareen, good to see you.
Good to be here.
How do you see the Indo-Pacific region changing course in the recent past as well as the future?
Look, I think before the Trump administration came in, there was already a lot of uncertainty which was growing in this region. There were new realignments taking place. People were hedging their bets. And I think after the Trump administration has come in, that uncertainty has only grown. And we don't know what, for example, the United States being the paramount power, what exactly its policy is going to be. So there are confused signals coming out of the US, and as a result, some of the other actions which the US has taken in other theaters of war around the world uh, would make many people or many countries feel rather jittery about depending upon the US insofar as their security is concerned. So I think there is now there is going to be even more uncertainty than what there was, and I think there will be even more hedging than what there was, and we are seeing some telltale signs of that already starting to emerge.
Right. Also, we can't talk about Indo-Pacific without mentioning China. There is a statement that has just come in by Wang Huning, who oversees Taiwan affairs for China, and I would quickly quote what he has said. He has urged Beijing to shape the inevitable reunification of the motherland. As it happens, it is the first time that this kind of phrase has been used by the government in Beijing, which has mentioned reunification in passing, but not in this manner. Could you put these two together, Indo-Pacific and this kind of a statement coming in from China in respect to Taiwan?
So look, Taiwan is one of the big hotspots insofar as the Indo-Pacific is concerned. And in fact, the entire credibility of the United States as a guarantor of security, as a partner for security and stability, hinges in large measure on what its posture is going to be insofar as Taiwan is concerned. Now, look, there have been these kind of statements coming out of Beijing plenty of times. In fact, not just statements coming out of Beijing, but Beijing has been constantly and consistently been ramping up the pressure on the Taiwanese. So whether it's those air operations which are taking place, whether it is the naval operations or trying to encircle the island to make a show of force, all of that has been happening now for a few years, in fact. Uh, but there was always this thing in the background that the Americans will not abandon Taiwan. Now, what has happened, I think yesterday or day before, when President Trump was asked about Taiwan, he preferred to keep a degree of strategic ambiguity. Now, there is some merit in keeping strategic ambiguity, but I think in a situation which is as tense as what we are seeing, uh, and given the fact that the Americans, for example, have simply abandoned, not just abandoned, abandoned in a rather bad way, the Ukrainians. Uh, and I think there's some merit in what the Americans have done insofar as the European theater is concerned. But what it's not important whether what the Americans have done is right or wrong. What is important is what is the messaging which goes out. And the messaging for countries which look to the United States as a net provider of security and stability in their regions, or for that matter globally, are no longer sure about whether they can rely upon the United States. So there is a reliability factor which has come in now. uh, Given what they have done in the European theater, to maintain a posture of strategic ambiguity in the Indo-Pacific, uh, will lead a lot of countries to wonder whether the Americans will come to their assistance, and will participate in any kind of a conflict on their side when push comes to shove. The Chinese, for their part, will also be reading the signals coming out of the United States very, very carefully. The Chinese were initially very, very jittery when Trump uh, won the election and then started saying what he was saying. But I think over a period of time, uh, and this is an impression which is now gaining ground. And the impression is that, look, the Americans are not going to really get into any kind of significant strategic contestation insofar as the Chinese are concerned. And there is this very disturbing talk of the US, the Russians, and the Chinese, in a sense, carving out the world between themselves. And what is being said, and again, this is mostly speculation, this is mostly assessments of people. There is no hard and fast kind of a treaty or understanding which has been reached by the Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans. But this is what is being speculated, that the Russians will now, Europe is going to be left on its own and they'll have to handle the Russians on their part. The Chinese will be the SHO of the Indo-Pacific, with American interests being protected, and of course the Americans and will be the dominant player in their hemisphere. And so, for example, yes, the Americans will contest the Chinese when it comes to a Panama, when it comes to some of the other countries around. They'll bully them, they'll browbeat them, and they'll get what they want out of them. But when it comes to China, the signals coming out of the White House are that, look, uh, uh, Xi is a good guy. I want to deal with him. We want to have good relations with the Chinese. We'll compete with them in the economic and the trade front, but we don't want a war. Now, the moment you say you don't want a war, I'm not saying that you should want a war, but the moment you tell somebody who's as aggressive as the Chinese are that, look, we don't want a war, the message that goes across is that, okay, fine, if they continue with their steady encroachment into other people's territories, converting an entire sea into their own personal lake, uh, those activities can go on, and the Americans are not going to really do anything about it. And if the Americans are not going to do about it, none of the other powers in the region are big enough or strong enough to challenge the Chinese might. So I think that's kind of a disturbing signal that seems to be coming in increasingly.
I have to say, it's very interesting that you say that China will be the SHO of Indo-Pacific, keeping American interests intact. I don't see. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I want to go back to something we spoke about last time. You said that Quad found its new meaning under Donald Trump, and it could find a newer meaning in the next 4 years. Now, Indian and Japanese prime ministers have already visited Washington, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, on his very first day at the job, met with his Quad counterparts, all echoing the same agenda of Indo-Pacific being open and free, but at the same time saying that China's influence needs to be countered. I want to ask you, in terms of Indo-Pacific and Quad, what do you expect?
Yeah, so see, we started off this conversation by talking about the growing uncertainties in the region. So there are these very confused signals emerging out of Washington. At one level, they are talking about Quad, they're talking about all the things that the Quad countries stand for, which is freedom of navigation, all of that stuff, which and that nobody is going to, encroach on anybody's territory, all of the stuff which is the bread and butter of what the Quad declarations are all about. Um, and given Donald Trump's earlier, approach towards the Quad, there is reason to be very, very bullish about, uh, the Americans taking Quad to the next level, and maybe expanding the Quad network and bringing in some other countries, Quad plus as it's called. So there is that is one set of signals coming in, and of course, in the U.S. administration, you have people like Marco Rubio, you have people like Tulsi Gabbard, you have the new NSA. All of these guys are people, who are very, very hard-headed and very, very realistic about what China stands for, what the big strategic threat to the United States is from China, and of course to US allies in the region. Now, that is one set of signals is coming. But you have the contrary set of signals, which we have spoken about just before this, right? Where the Americans are saying, look, we want very good relations with the Chinese. They're great partners. We want to have good and free trade. We will not let them take advantage of us. But we want to have a we want to have a robust trade relationship, economic relationship. Nobody wants a war in the region. At one level, you're saying all of that, and then, of course, is the speculation which I was telling you, that we are going to carve out the world, which has not happened for the first time. It happened after Second World War, when the Brits, the Americans, and the Russians were meeting and carving out the world and their spheres of influence. So there is similar speculation, and I said this earlier, that this is speculation. This is assessments of people on the basis of what they see happening. There is no certainty that this is the direction in which things are going to go. But if that speculation has even some kernel of truth in it, then it means that you're back to that old uh, system of spheres of influence, and all this nonsense and crap that had been fed to everybody over the last 20 years, that the end of history has come, and that now we will be marching into a brave new world in which all people will live in peace with each other. All those old theories of spheres of influence and alignments and block politics is all gone. History has come full circle. So I think we are entering into an age like that, where there are no rules of the game anymore. And while we will keep talking about and virtue signaling on this whole issue of rules based order, the problem is that the guys who frame the rules have neither the will or the capacity or the ability or the stamina to enforce those rules. So new rules of the game are going to be set, and that is it. So if you are strong, you will be part of that framework which will set the rules, and if you are weak, you will suffer what the weak will suffer. So I suppose that's the direction we are going to go into.
When we talk about the Indo-Pacific, it's expected to mention India, the US, China, Japan, Australia. But there's also another thing. A high-level European Union delegation is visiting in New Delhi as we speak. They're urging for more decisive approach towards the Indo-Pacific. What do you make of that?
The Europeans are even more confused than anybody else. They still seem to be suffering from the nostalgia of power of a few decades back, when they were not only an economic power, a technological power, but also a major strategic force to contend with. You look at the European countries today. Look at the way they are running helter skelter, simply because the Americans have told them that you need to start paying for your own security. The Europeans are having a party at other people's expense. They were mooching the US like never before. Uh, right? Their armies are laughable right now. So for the Europeans to now start talking about in those terms in which they are now talking about, I frankly speaking, uh, nobody's taking the Europeans very seriously these days. It's okay, yeah, everybody wants to do business and all of that, but purely in terms of hard power, purely in terms of uh, economic power which they bring to the table, uh, purely in terms of basic common sense and a sense of realism about the direction in which the world is moving and where their own interests lie. I think they're utterly confused. Now, if they're going to be confused about themselves, then I don't think it makes any sense for anybody to really bank upon them and expect that, if they lend their weight to this whole Indo-Pacific theater, it'll make a very big difference because, like I said, nobody really takes them very seriously.
Yeah, a strong statement there. Um, I'm going to ask my next question, bearing in mind that it might sound like warmongering, but I want to tell our viewers that that's not my purpose. But every time we talk about Indo-Pacific, we always say that it's a very strategic region, but it's also a very complicated region. So many countries are involved. Not all of them see eye to eye, and then of course now we have Europe trying to exert its own like power, if at all we can call it power. Then we, of course, we have the US and China's internal rivalry and all of that. So while everyone's trying to meet their national interests, do you fear that this could become something that we are not exactly able to, um, I don't know, predict properly?
Look, frankly, I don't think anybody is going to be able to predict precisely in which direction things are going. Because, in the kind of uncertainty that exists, uh, it's impossible to, call it correctly. It's at best an educated guess on what direction people are going to go. But I think the people forming India's foreign policy are no spring chickens. These are people who have made policy uh, very wisely, I would say, in many cases. So, for example, and I must confess, I'm guilty of it. We would keep hearing the word strategic autonomy, and after some time, it had started becoming a little grating. That we keep talking about strategic autonomy. What the hell does it actually mean? Today, we realize what the hell it actually means when suddenly Ukraine, which was the apple of the eye till 6 months back, is today nobody really wants to own it up, right? They're left on their own. The Americans are saying, okay, fine, no more aid coming to you. Whatever minerals and all you have, you now shuck it up and you give it to us. We are not going to give you any security guarantees. The Russians can keep whatever lands they've captured, and that's it. Those are the wages at which you will have to work now. Okay, uh, if the Ukrainians had a degree of strategic autonomy, whereby they could decide what actually was in their interest and what was not in their interest, or they were in a position to decide that uh, even though their benefactors and their friends were suggesting a particular course of action, their interests would be better served by following another course of action. They didn't have that autonomy. So, for example, uh, and like I said, I'm myself guilty of it by questioning what the hell do we mean by strategic autonomy. But when we started buying and we ensured that we are not going to ruin our relationship with Russia simply because the West is exhorting us to, sever all our links with Russia, uh, that was what strategic autonomy is all about. Strategic autonomy is about that if I have to confront the Chinese or the Pakistanis or anybody else, I will do it on the basis of my own strength, and I will beef up my own strength. Yes, if other countries, other partners come and help me, assist me, uh, I'll be so much the better for it. But I am not going to depend that okay, somebody else has my back, so that's how I'm going to proceed. So I think the credit of the Indian foreign policy establishment and the security establishment, there is a lot of merit in the policy which we adopted. Now, having said that, when we are coming into this new world which you are talking about, I think many countries are now going to make those calculations, which is what we spoke about right at the outset when we said that look, countries are now starting to hedge their bets. maybe 20 years, 30 years back, nobody would have batted an eyelid and would have decided to go with the Americans, blindfolded. Today, I don't think any country in Southeast Asia, for example, or in the entire Indo-Pacific is ready to put all their eggs in the American basket, especially not now. So the Americans might be doing whatever they are doing in their own interest, but I think they are probably creating a situation where if they want their allies and partners uh, to to be in some kind of a grouping, some kind of an understanding, have a larger strategic alignment, then they need to really start doing more work than what they have been doing so far to reassure all those countries. Otherwise, people are going to continue to hedge their bets and try and cut their own side deals, and which is what means that that entire grand strategy that should have been formulated to contain China, to make sure that its aggressiveness and its assertiveness was contained, goes out of the window.
All right, Mr. Sareen, thank you so much for all those insights. It was good to speak to you.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.